I was just a pilot, living my dream until that fateful day at Pearl Harbor. Losing my arm was only the beginning. My wife, Ronnie, abandoned me when I needed her most, finding solace in another man. In the skies, I faced betrayal and heartbreak, but it was Susan, my old flame, who brought me back to life. Amidst the chaos of war, our love reignited. Yet the haunting memory of Connie's death at the hands of Sammy, a reckless pilot, drives me. With vengeance in my heart, I embarked on a mission to seek justice. This is my story of loss, betrayal, and a love that defied all odds. The General Dynamics F-16. V roared past the spectators and seamlessly entered a hard 9G turn, showcasing why it's the premier fighter jet. Without losing momentum, the pilot sharply pulled the jet upward and engaged the afterburner. The powerful engine propelled the jet skyward into the summer clouds almost instantly, reducing the F-16 to a mere dot in the sky. It looped through the air, suddenly reappearing behind the crowd, flying low. The jet's thunderous roar shook the ground as the pilot executed a wide loop, transitioning into a challenging maneuver known as a half-Cuban 8. Soaring back over the awe-struck crowd, the jet rumbled in the distance for a few moments before zooming past the grandstand again, this time flying upside down. The pilot then snapped the jet into a quick roll and vanished into the clouds. The lingering noise left the crowd of thousands in brief silence before erupting into loud cheers. An elderly man glanced at his granddaughter, a spirited 14-year-old with a long blonde ponytail poking out of her Air Force cap. Expecting excitement, he was surprised to see tears in her eyes. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked. She replied, "Why can't girls do that?" The old man smiled, knowing a secret. "Come with me," he said. She gave him a curious look, but followed him towards the flight line. The colorful F-16, adorned with snake eyes and fangs, had just come to a halt, its engine winding down. They approached the tape barrier where the old man flashed his ID. The guard respectfully raised the tape for them. "Yes, sir," he acknowledged. The crew prepared the maintenance platform. After some adjustments, the pilot climbed out of the cockpit and descended the steps with confidence. The granddaughter watched in amazement as the pilot removed the helmet, revealing a cascade of blonde hair. The pilot turned and waved at the old man. "Well, do you want to meet her or not?" he asked. Air Force Major Amy Bojo Fuller, head of the Viper demonstration unit and a true hero, had maintained contact with the old man after meeting him years ago at an event. "Amy, my granddaughter thinks girls can't fly," he said. Major Fuller laughed, handed her helmet to a nearby officer, and said, "Captain, take over." She added, "Hasn't your granddad told you about the Wasps?" It was a sunny Sunday in Oahu. We were flying over the harbor while the ships below prepared for morning services. Up early, we headed to John Rogers Field at Barber's Point for Ronnie's final check ride before she could fly solo. The night before had been late, but we rose early for this important flight. I chose the vibrant blue Waco UPF-7 for us, a beautiful biplane with a powerful engine, much better than the smaller planes we usually flew. We took off as the sun rose over the Pacific. Usually I sat beside Ronnie during her practice flights, enjoying the view and her company. But today, I sat in the rear seat like a real instructor. As Ronnie practiced landings, she flew out over Ford Island each time to join the landing pattern again. Planes didn't have radios back then, so strict flight patterns were essential to avoid collisions. Part of the training involved learning these patterns and watching for other aircraft. Ronnie was at the controls, aligning with the runway. I was scanning the sky for other planes when I saw a fighter jet heading straight for us. Quickly taking control, I made a sharp turn. Ronnie screamed as the fighter zoomed past, shaking our plane. I looked back, trying to see the fighter's tail number. Pilots were supposed to avoid this airspace. I wanted this guy's fuzzy dice from my rearview mirror. What I saw left me stunned. The fighter wasn't one of Hickham's Curtiss P-40Bs with stars and bars on its wings. It was a Mitsubishi A6M0, bearing the Empire of Japan's rising sun symbol. Turning to look back at Pearl Harbor, I saw black smoke beginning to rise. The American fleet was under attack. The Zero's pilot had scared me out of my wits. but at least I could act. Forget the flight pattern. I needed to get us on the ground fast. Another Zero was lining up to shoot at us. Ronnie was freaking out in the front as I pushed the throttle all the way, diving the Waco steeply. I was glad for the bigger, sturdier plane. A smaller one might have lost its wings under such stress. Luckily, Ronnie had aligned us with the runway, and I aimed for the landing slot at 130 miles per hour, far exceeding the Waco's top speed and very risky for landing. I pulled back on the stick at the last second. The G-force pushed us into our seats. Ronnie screamed again, which was getting annoying, but the Waco made a surprisingly smooth landing. I would have been proud if not for the guy trying to kill us. Our sudden deceleration threw off the enemy pilot, and he soared over us without firing a shot. I knew he'd be back, and seconds felt like hours as I frantically steered the Waco toward the hangar. Upon arrival, I hit the brakes, and we screeched to a halt. Ronnie used the wing to steady herself as she disembarked. Climbing out from the back seat proved more difficult for me, taking precious extra seconds. Just as Ronnie vanished into the hangar, the Zero pilot resumed firing. Bullets started to strike around me as I ran, about 10 yards behind her. I instinctively raised my arms to protect myself, a futile gesture against machine gun and cannon rounds. I glimpsed my left arm as a shell tore through it, severing it 4 inches below the elbow. A foot to the right, and it would have struck my head. Surrounded by a pink mist, I still didn't fully grasp what had happened. I continued running until I reached the hangar, seeking shelter as the Japanese planes targeted it. Fortunately, the Zeros were flying with Kates and Vals to bomb Pearl Harbor and lacked the small bombs they sometimes carried. Inside, Ronnie turned, saw me, screamed, and fainted. Only then did I notice my left side drenched in blood. I too collapsed, waking up in a hospital bed at Hickam, 20 miles away. A Navy nurse, who was also a flight student, had applied a tourniquet and saved my life. My flying days, however, were over. Congressional Airport hosted the civilian pilot training program for the Washington, D.C. area. It was accessible by car, but there was always traffic on Rockville Pike, making it easy to hitch a ride or take a bus. My father had Ivy League dreams for me after high school, but I was tired of him planning my life. I secretly enrolled in the CPT program, convinced I could become a pilot and make my dad accept it. I was full of bravado, like most 18-year-olds, big, loud, and reckless, qualities that led me to pursue flying, the craziest yet most exhilarating thing I'd ever done. The program cost $35, a significant sum back then, covering the medical exam and life insurance. I had saved the money, but the challenge was sneaking off to the airfield without my parents knowing. They probably suspected I was meeting someone, but flying would have shocked them more. A funny double standard, really. Flight instruction followed ground school, which taught air regulations, navigation, and weather. After passing the ground school exam, we needed 35 hours of flight time for a license, 8 hours with an instructor, 9 hours of check time, and 18 hours solo. I trained in a Piper Cub with basic instruments. Its engine maxed out at 87 miles per hour, making it gentle and easy to fly. Yet it was terrifying to be 3,000 feet up, held aloft by thin steel tubes and fabric like a kite. I tried not to think about it. My dad nearly lost it when I told him I wanted to fly instead of attending college. In 1940, pilots were seen as daredevils, not heroes. The CPT program aimed to change that perception by encouraging more people to fly. My parents were typical of their era. Dad, a staunch Democrat, idolized FDR, while my mother, from a high-class Virginia family, voted conservatively. I was indifferent to politics, despite my current job. My dad worked for the Treasury Department, a prestigious position that afforded him influence and a good income. I attended St. Albans, a boys-only school in Georgetown, just a short walk from home. To meet girls, we often went to nearby schools like Merritt. That's where I met Susan. Our schools were close, less than a mile apart, and filled with wealthy kids. The annual soccer game was a big event. I was the goalkeeper for St. Albans, a role I reluctantly accepted each year. Being a goalie was 99% boredom and 1% terror, diving in front of players, charging to score, risking injury with minimal protective gear. In my last game as a senior, the referee, looking stern in his black shirt, awarded a last-second penalty kick that could tie the game. It was me against Jack Lamberton, a formidable opponent. As he prepared to kick, I glanced left, prompting him to aim right. I dove right and stopped the ball, covering it up. Lamberton's follow-through kick struck my head. We won the game, but I was knocked out and missed the celebration. I woke to the pungent aroma of smelling salts, disoriented and unsure if I had died and gone to heaven. My teammates were celebrating far away while the opposing players stormed off angrily. No one seemed to notice me lying on the ground. Susan, the coach's daughter and the team's trainer, paid close attention. She was Lamberton's girlfriend and saw him look at me before walking away, satisfied. Susan rushed over with her medical kit, gently placing my head on her lap. When I opened my eyes, she asked, "Are you all right?" Dazed and confused, I took a moment to understand. "Who are you?" I mumbled. It wasn't smooth, but back then, head injuries weren't taken seriously. "They just told you to shake it off," she replied. "I'm Susan Lawson, the mascot trainer. Just lie here until you feel better." Still a bit dazed, I asked, "What happened?" "You got kicked in the head at the end of the game," she said. I vaguely remembered playing soccer. "Who won?" I asked. She laughed. "Does it matter? It's over. Let me help you up." She stood and helped me to my feet. I took a moment to look at her. She was beautiful. Susan smiled and asked, "Like what you see?" I eagerly replied, "Oh God, yes." She laughed and shook her head, leading me to the moire bench. She fit perfectly under my arm and even smelled nice. We sat while I tried to clear my head. When I finally looked at her face, I saw she had blue eyes, a pretty face, and thick auburn hair. She was gorgeous. Feeling better, I knew it was time to leave. Susan seemed a bit sad, so I asked, "Would you like to go out sometime? I owe you dinner for taking care of me." Susan looked happy, but said, "I have a boyfriend, but we can go out as a thank you." We were both fooling ourselves. I asked her to write down her phone number. She didn't have paper, so she wrote it on my hand with a pen. I called her the next Tuesday and asked her out for that Saturday. I had a '32 Ford Roadster convertible, which was pretty fast. I grew up with a lot of perks, including a rusty blue convertible that everyone loved. My dad had bought it for $50 and let me use it, but only to keep me in check. Susan lived near the zoo in Woodley Park. Her dad taught at Merritt and had a lot of inherited money. Their house was even bigger than mine, like a mansion on a pretty street. Susan's world was perfect, like those old sappy family movies. When I got to her house, her dad greeted me in a cardigan and with a pipe. Her mom wasn't around. He hinted that Susan had a boyfriend who was also his favorite student, making it tense when Susan entered the room. Her dad lit up when he saw her. She looked great in a neat schoolgirl outfit, her shining hair tied in 2 ponytails, making her look lively. I could tell Susan's dad didn't trust me. "I want her back by 9:30. Where are you taking her?" he asked. Susan, looking amused, replied, "Eric is taking me out to eat to thank me for helping him after the game last Friday." "We're going to Martin's Tavern, sir," I said, knowing it was a place her dad liked, despite its shady reputation for attracting politicians. As we got in my car, Susan asked, "We're not really going to that boring place, are we?" I laughed and said, "No way. I'm taking you somewhere you'll love." Susan didn't press for details. She seemed curious and was growing on me, despite dating Lamberton, the star athlete. She was fun and smart, a hard combination to ignore. During our 30-minute drive to Rockville, we talked a lot. I learned Susan had big dreams and plans, fitting for the homecoming queen, star of the musical, and top of the class. I wasn't thinking about a future with her. Her love life didn't matter to me, but her story showed she was always pleasing others, especially her parents, who put a lot of pressure on her. On the other hand, I was rebellious and didn't care what people thought of me. I always went against the grain. Susan looked confused when I turned onto a rough road and stopped near a big barn. "Where are we?" she asked. "Right where I planned," I replied. She looked skeptical and said, "If you think I'm rolling in the hay, you're wrong." I laughed and said, "Follow me." I led her to a small airplane parked in a hangar. Susan was amazed. "Get in, you'll love it," I told her, helping her into the plane. After a quick check, I sat next to her. My friend Stephen, the mechanic, helped start the engine. Soon we were taxiing out, leaving clouds of smoke behind us. With no air traffic control, we just took off when ready. We rolled for a while before the plane lifted off, climbing into the sky at 40 miles. Susan was scared during takeoff but soon looked thrilled. She turned to me with bright eyes and said, "This is the most exciting thing I've ever done." I smiled, knowing I had made the right choice. Susan was born for adventure. We flew southwest at 1,000 feet, heading toward the Potomac River at the Great Falls. Seeing the view was exciting even for me. Susan gazed out the open side window, looking down in awe. We were flying at around 50 knots, and she occasionally extended her hand into the wind, feeling its gentle caress. She kept glancing at me with joy in her eyes, clearly captivated by the experience. "Do you want to try it?" I asked. She nodded eagerly. "Just follow the river and keep it steady," I instructed. "If you pull back, you go up," I demonstrated. "If you want to go down, push the wheel forward." I returned us to our original altitude. Susan grabbed the right-hand wheel, focusing intensely, her tongue peeking out of the corner of her lips. The trim tabs did most of the work, but then a gust of wind hit us, sending the light Taylorcraft nearly sideways. Susan didn't panic. She calmly corrected our course. "That was great. You're a natural," I praised her. She beamed at me. Seizing the moment, I added, "Why don't I give you lessons?" Her eyes lit up with longing. "Really? You'd do that for me?" I knew she was interested in flying, not necessarily in me, but teaching Susan to fly would bring us closer. As a qualified CPT program instructor, I was always on the lookout for new students. "We can fill out the papers when we get back. Meanwhile, let's tour Georgetown." By then, we had reached Cheney Bridge. I took over, flying along the Palisades until we reached the university, dropping down to 150 feet. Regulations were more relaxed back then, allowing us a fantastic view of Elm Street. Traffic buzzed, bars and restaurants were alive with people, and city lights were starting to twinkle. On our way back to Rockville, I took a detour to fly over Susan's house, dropping to 100 feet. She sounded upset. "That's Jack's car in the driveway." Her mom must have called her boyfriend when Susan left. Susan would have some explaining to do. I hoped Lamberton would act poorly enough to push her my way. I almost laughed at the thought. It was dusk when we landed, navigating the tricky field with no lights. We rolled to a stop, and Susan just sat there in the fading light. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I don't want this to end," she said sadly. "It doesn't have to. We can arrange lessons. Just call me and we can set them up." As a certified instructor, I got paid for each student I recruited, making it beneficial for both of us. Susan filled out the papers and then pulled out $40 from her purse. I had to save for 6 months to get that much money. When I dropped her off, Lamberton stayed inside. Susan said, "Jack's going to be angry, but he doesn't own me. I'll call you as soon as things settle down here." I watched her walk up the steps to her house, feeling pangs of jealousy. She waved at me longingly before going inside. I never heard from Susan again. Maybe her parents or Lamberton intervened, but the phone never rang. I didn't see it as a betrayal since we hadn't made any promises. Things just happen. Still, it bummed me out, and I spent a couple of weeks wondering what could have been. I realized that hoping for a long-term relationship was a fantasy. Susan was too tied to her current life, always identifying herself as Lamberton's girl. Besides, teenage boys like me didn't stay focused on one thing for long. Soon, I moved on from my crush. I told my parents I planned to be a full-time instructor with the CPT instead of going to Princeton. That decision got me kicked out of the house. My dad said, "If you want to be your own man, you have to support yourself." I didn't mind. The CPT paid $80 a month, more than most households made back then, and it got me away from my parents. So I took a job in Fort Collins, Colorado right away. Looking back, it was a selfish and ungrateful act that almost broke my mother. But at 18, like most boys, I was self-centered and driven by my dream of flying. If someone had told me that getting up at 4:30 in the morning and working until 8 p.m. could be fun, I would have laughed. That was until I got to Fort Collins. But I loved my work as an instructor, and all the flying made me a much better pilot. The practical reason for taking that job was to learn how to fly at high altitudes. Just taking off in Fort Collins was like flying at 5,000 feet in Rockville, teaching me to handle thin air. The winds in the Rockies could be challenging, but growing up in Maryland with its cold, snowy winters prepared me. Fort Collins convinced me to take a similar job in Hawaii. Honolulu was a lively place in October 1941, buzzing with military activity. It was far more exciting than the quiet, sleepy Fort Collins. But the real excitement began when Veronica McMartin walked into the office the week I started my new job at Andrews Flying. Ronnie, as she liked to be called, seemed like trouble from the moment she entered. Some people have an air about them, a confidence that borders on arrogance, making them stand out and often annoying everyone else. Ronnie was one of those people. My manager, Jake Hill, saw her and muttered, "Oh." Then he looked at me and said, "You deal with this one." I groaned, "Why me?" I watched as Hill greeted Ronnie and brought her over to me. She was stunning, and we stared at each other, a silent acknowledgement of mutual attraction. Ronnie had an exotic look, half Japanese, half Anglo, with long, smooth black hair and dark eyes that sparkled with an alluring depth. She gave me a look that seemed to size me up. I'm taller than average, with unruly brown hair, gray eyes, and a long face. Ronnie had a perfect oval face with high cheekbones, a small pointed chin, and a wide, captivating mouth. But the most striking feature was her fit body, accentuated by her stylish flying attire. She wore camel pants and a leather jacket draped over one shoulder, reminiscent of Amelia Earhart's fashion. The jacket seemed out of place in Hawaii, but it gets cold in the sky. The loose pants fit her hips and backside as if tailored for her, and her white silk blouse highlighted her figure. Hill introduced her. "Eric, this is Veronica McMartin." I tore my gaze from her, and she smiled as she said, "Call me Ronnie." Trying to seem composed, I replied, "I'm Eric." But we both knew there was more between us. Our flying lesson started off rocky. I walked Ronnie out to the tarmac where a Piper J3 awaited. The Piper was the standard plane for beginner flights, with seats arranged one behind the other, controls in the front, and a stick and throttle in the back. While I checked the plane, Ronnie got in the front seat. "You sit in the back for these flights," I told her. She retorted, "I'm paying and I want to sit up front." "The rudder pedals are only in the front. You have to sit in the back," I explained. She stubbornly stayed put. I sighed. "I can't steer the plane from the back seat, so either move or the lesson is over before it starts." Ronnie glared at me but moved to the back. I thought to myself, what a spoiled person. I sat in the front seat and said, "Put on the headset so we can talk during the flight." She did, looking annoyed. Clearly, she was used to getting her way. The mechanic and I started the plane and we taxied out. Over the intercom, I instructed, "Put your right hand on the stick and your left hand on the throttle. Just feel the movements during this flight." I revved the engine and we took off at a slow 40 miles per hour, leveling off at 1,000 feet, cruising at 60 miles per hour over the Pacific Ocean toward Pearl Harbor. Ronnie had been quiet, but I felt her hand on the stick as I moved it. I adjusted the engine speed as we descended. Alarmed, Ronnie asked, "What's wrong with the engine?" I laughed. "I'm just keeping the oil temperature up. You'll learn all this soon." We landed and taxied back slowly. I turned off the ignition and fuel. For a moment, there was silence. Then Ronnie's voice came over the intercom. "Would you like to come to my place for a drink to celebrate?" I turned to see her eyes filled with desire. Ronnie's quick change didn't surprise me. Some women are attracted by the thrill and dependency they feel in a plane. She was clearly excited. I thought, why not? She was attractive, and I was young and interested. Plus, I never turned down a chance for fun. "Sure, let's go," I said, "but I usually bike to work." I did own an old Chevy, but it was at home. When I told her, she simply said, "I'll drive." I still wasn't sure what she had in mind, but she seemed eager. We walked out to the parking lot, and there I saw a classy maroon 1939 Oldsmobile coupe. "Nice car," I remarked. She replied with a bitter tone, "I got it from my ex in the divorce. Not married." Now that was interesting. Ronnie had always seemed unfriendly toward men. It takes about 30 minutes to drive from Barbers Point to Makiki, mostly because you have to go all the way around Pearl Harbor. During the drive, we talked to get to know each other. I learned Ronnie was 8 years older than me. It may not sound like a big difference, but it meant she had much more life experience than I did. Ronnie was born in Hawaii, making her a U.S. citizen by law, even though Hawaii didn't become a state until 18 years later. Her dad was a colonel at Fort Shafter, so she grew up on the base surrounded by soldiers. This likely made her feel very important. Ronnie was very beautiful, and people noticed her even before she turned 16. Though her dad's position kept most soldiers away, Captain Roger McMartin wasn't like the others. He was charming and worked directly with Ronnie's dad, which gave him special access to her. McMartin knew how to win women over, and Ronnie, at 18, was inexperienced compared to him. He played on her vanity and inexperience to win her over. Surprisingly, he became enamored with her passion and married her. Their marriage lasted 7 years. As we drove, Ronnie said, "I tried to be a good wife, but I was too young and he could never stay faithful." She looked sad as she continued, "I caught him cheating and he promised to stop, but when I caught him with my cousin, I knew it was time to leave." She added with a hint of satisfaction, "His family had plantations up by Wahiawa. My dad used military rules to get the most out of him, including my car and house." Ronnie was a 7th grade teacher at Punahou, but her house was in nearby Makiki Heights, an expensive area. Even back then, it was a large 1-story house with beautiful landscaping and a driveway made of crushed lava. From that elevation, you could see for miles. Her nice house showed. She got a lot out of her divorce. I, on the other hand, lived in Iowa Beach, an area mostly populated by Asians and Pacific Islanders. The houses there were affordable, so I was able to buy a small beachfront house, though it was not in the best condition. Ronnie opened her door made of carved wood, and we walked into a large living area with fancy furniture and a great view of the ocean through big windows. I had been in charge during our flight, but this was her domain now. "What do you want to drink?" she asked. I requested a Primo, a local beer. She brought me a cold bottle and got a glass of wine for herself. It felt like she was just getting the formalities out of the way. We walked out onto the balcony with a beautiful view of Pearl Harbor, and the ships docked there. The breeze carried the sweet scent of flowers, gently moving Ronnie's long hair. The warm sun made the scene feel serene, detached from the busy life on the base. Ronnie's beauty was striking, with a perfectly shaped face and large, dark eyes that made her even more special. Her eyes were looking at me with a mix of desire and challenge. As we stood side by side, sipping our drinks and gazing at the harbor, Ronnie took my beer and set it down with her wine. Her eyes told me something was about to happen. I still didn't really understand how I ended up in this situation. It all happened so fast. But Ronnie was a determined woman. She had decided to enjoy an afternoon with her young flight instructor without worrying about the consequences. Her strong desires were warning signs, but I was too young and naive to heed them. Ronnie grabbed the back of my head and kissed me hard. She moaned, and her mouth opened as we kissed deeply. I had experienced a lot of fleeting romances during my 2 years flying for the CPT. It was a perk of the job. Yet this was still surprising and a little unsettling. Even so, I knew when to take charge. Ronnie's house was open and airy, with bedrooms off the main space. I took her hand and led her gently toward the nearest bedroom. Her excitement was obvious, which was a good sign. I stopped next to the bed and looked directly into her eyes. She stood there, breathing hard as I undressed her slowly. Her eyes were filled with desire. I'll always remember revealing Ronnie's perfect body. Everything about her was just right. The rise and fall of her breaths was like the gentle movements of the Pacific Ocean. Ronnie was clearly very excited. And that, my friends, is how Ronnie McMartin and I got together. We were just two people who liked flying and spending time together. It wasn't really love. It was more like a strong desire. It could have been something more. But then the war started. The hospitals were full of wounded soldiers and civilians. I wasn't in critical condition, so I was left on a stretcher in a crowded hallway. My left arm was tied to a board with an IV drip in it. A doctor had treated my arm, making it look like I had a club instead of a hand. The pain would have been bad, but they gave me strong painkillers. I was lying there, feeling sorry for myself when Ronnie showed up and made things worse. I saw her walking down the hall. She looked cool and beautiful. Ronnie stopped and stood there, looking like she was preparing for something unpleasant. I gave her a silly smile, high on the medication. She said, sounding worried, "Oh, Eric, how terrible. Will you be okay?" I mumbled, "I'm fine, except for the blood loss." I nodded at my club-like hand and added, "I broke my throttle hand so I can still fly." I reached for her, and she pulled back. Confused, I asked, "What?" Ronnie hesitated, then blurted out, "It's been fun, Eric, but I can't get the image of you covered in blood out of my head." I stared at her, shocked. What was she saying? She continued, "And the thought of you touching me with that stump creeps me out, so it's better that we end it." Maybe it was the drugs, but I whined, "End it! What do you mean?" Ronnie gave me an angry look and said coldly, "I can't even look at you, let alone be with you. We're done. Over. Don't try to contact me," she said, giving me a pat on the shoulder before turning and walking away. I should have seen it coming. Ronnie was selfish, and we had little in common. We both enjoyed flying and being together physically, that was it. Yet being hurt and then dumped in the hospital crushed me. It wasn't until later that I realized this moment marked the beginning of my transformation. Ronnie had revealed the truth about me. I was a selfish, childish man without direction or care for others. Even worse, I wasn't contributing anything meaningful to society. All my choices had been about my own happiness. That's why I chose to be a flyer instead of going to college, much to my parents' disappointment. I loved flying, but it had led me to a toxic relationship with a troubled woman. Lying in that bright, bare hallway, I had an epiphany. Good people take responsibility for their lives, and I had only cared about myself so far. I decided I needed to be more responsible, both for myself and for others. I realized the future held more wars, and I had been shot early on, so what should I do next? Injured people kept arriving, and the medical staff worked tirelessly to help them. My arm had been neatly severed by a 20 shell, and they had sewn skin over the end. Now my left arm looked like the end of a sausage. After they gave me more blood, they let me go. Since the military couldn't use me anymore, I needed to get home. But many people were trying to leave Hawaii, making it hard to get on a ship. I sent a telegram to my dad asking for help. Maybe this was the first sign of my growing maturity. He got me a spot on a Navy supply ship heading back to San Francisco. I knew the trip would be dangerous. The aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were still out there, and submarines lurked in the waters. So I sent a letter to my parents in case I didn't make it. I told them I loved them and was sorry for being so difficult. They didn't deserve my bad attitude, and I promised to make amends if they welcomed me back with open arms. To my surprise, when I got back to Georgetown, I found out I was a minor celebrity. I was the first person to return home injured from Pearl Harbor, but the real heroes were still serving or had died there. Politicians wanted to use my fame to their advantage, so I was busy for a few weeks after I got home. This included a planned visit with Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House. That's why I was standing in my best suit with my parents when the First Lady walked into the East Room. By then, Eleanor Roosevelt was more popular than her husband. She was very smart and excellent at connecting with people, so she wasn't surrounded by a big entourage. It was just an older woman walking into the room, followed by some reporters. We had a planned public talk about civilians being at Pearl Harbor during the attack. Reporters took photos and shouted questions. The First Lady handled it all with grace. Then, after the reporters left, she wanted to talk to me alone. That was the kind of person she was. During our conversation, she asked me a question that changed my life. "What are you going to do now?" I replied honestly. "I'd love to serve, but no branch will take me with one arm." I added sadly, "I was a good pilot, an instructor, and I wish someone would let me help in the war." The First Lady gave me a thoughtful look and asked, "Can you still fly?" I showed her my left arm. It wasn't like Captain Hook's hook. It even had a watch on it. It was attached to a leather sleeve that I put over my stump every morning. It was secured around my elbow by a harness. The plastic looked like skin, and people wouldn't know I was missing anything unless they looked closely. I said proudly, "It's made to fit a throttle or a stick so I can fly anything, anywhere. But the military won't accept me, even though I have lots of experience." The First Lady smiled and said, "Then there's someone you should talk to." In 1941, Jacqueline Cochran, Jackie to her friends, was the best female pilot in the world. She had won the Bendix Air Race twice, set speed and altitude records, and was known as the Queen of Speed. She believed that qualified women pilots could do all the non-combat flying men could do, freeing up male pilots for combat. Jackie was very beautiful and a Bendix Trophy winner, which made her famous and gave her influence with Eleanor Roosevelt. The idea of women doing non-combat flying made sense to the First Lady and would help the war effort. She supported it. Anyone who understood saw that logistics were key in war. Napoleon said it best, "An army travels on its stomach." The problem was, even though American factories were producing plenty of planes, they still had to be delivered using male pilots, which meant fewer pilots for combat. The solution was clear: use qualified women to deliver the planes. But even with a severe pilot shortage, the Army leaders resisted. The best way to motivate Jackie Cochran was to tell her she couldn't do something. This trait drove her to constantly push Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces, to create an all-woman ferry pilot group. Her persistence led to the establishment of the 319th Women's Air Service Pilots, known as the Wasps. The Wasps' mascot was a female cartoon character drawn by Disney named Fifi. While pilots believed gremlins were imaginary creatures that sabotaged their planes, the Wasps saw Fifi as their protector. Fifi, they believed, kept sand out of their gas tanks and engines running smoothly, ensuring they came home safely. However, Arnold faced resistance from his tough, traditional commanders who couldn't accept women as equals. As a result, Arnold made the Wasps a civilian volunteer group rather than a military one, placing these brave women in the same category as office workers at the Pentagon. This status didn't deter Jackie or the other Wasps. They had signed up to serve America and were determined to do their best, no matter the challenges, prejudice, or conditions they faced. The first training class, known as the Guinea Pigs, took the same oath as male flight students and followed the same rules. They marched in formation, believing they would eventually join the Army, unlike the Women's Army Corps, WACs, who did traditional women's work like being operators and secretaries. The Wasps, however, flew fighter planes and bombers, traditionally seen as men's jobs. Despite the importance of their work, some men were uncomfortable seeing women perform these roles. Incredibly, Congress used this discomfort to deny military benefits to the Wasps. When a Wasp was killed in service, her family had to pay to bring her home, or her fellow Wasps would collect money to help. They couldn't receive traditional military honors like a flag on their coffin or a gold star in a window. Yet these brave women continued to fly and sometimes die for America. For me, the Wasps changed my life. A week after my talk at the White House, a telegram arrived at my parents' house. It invited me to meet Jackie Cochran. After a phone call and a car ride to the Hay Adams, I found myself in a room with Cochran herself. Jackie Cochran was impressive. She could outfly you, outfight you, or charm you, depending on what was needed. She was also married to the head of RKO Pictures, making her seem like a movie star. Jackie began with a smile. "So you were in the air during the attack at Pearl Harbor? What were you flying?" "A Waco UPF-7, I replied eagerly. Cochran looked nostalgic. "I flew its big brother in the Pulitzer air races. It's a great plane, fast and agile." "Thankfully, it saved my life," I said. Cochran leaned back in her plush chair, intrigued. "Tell me about it." I recounted. "I went into a full-throttle power dive after the first pass from the enemy, then pulled a big recovery. Any other plane would have lost its wings." She asked, "How did you get your wound then?" "I was hit on the ground while running for cover," I said with a sad smile. "I was never very fast on my feet." "Can you still fly?" Cochran inquired. I rolled up my left sleeve to show my prosthesis. "I can fly just as well as I used to. They made my prosthesis so I could use the controls or even hold the stick." "Do you have something I can do?" I asked eagerly. Cochran gave a serious look. "Do I ever?" The Wasps trained at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. Male pilots often tried to land there, claiming engine problems, to get a glimpse of the women. To stop this, Jackie banned unauthorized landings, and Avenger Field became known as Cochran's Convent. I arrived at Sweetwater for training class 43-2. The Wasps were run and staffed by women, but there were never enough trainers, which is where I came in. Jackie recruited anyone she could, even a one-armed pilot like me. At 22 years old, this was my first assignment, and I was nervous. There was a chain of command like any civilian agency. Jackie was the boss, and senior instructors like me managed the training units. I handled paperwork and supervised junior flying instructors, some of whom were men like me. The training included 3 phases of flight training. First, 70 hours in Stearman Cadets and Fairchild PT-19S. Then, They moved to the Vultee BT-13 for another 70 hours of basic flight training. If they passed, they completed 70 hours in the North American AT-6 or the twin-engine Cessna AT-17 Bobcat. All these flights required qualified instructors regardless of gender. The training period was 27 weeks, just like for male pilots. However, the women weren't taught combat flying, so there was no gunnery or formation flying. They also didn't learn evasive maneuvers like the men did. The Wasps were mostly ferry pilots. The Wasps were remarkably skilled, flying many types of planes. A Wasp would inspect a new plane to ensure it was ready to ship, then ferry it to its destination. Their role was crucial to the war effort, as vital as combat itself. My new group of trainees were women of all shapes and sizes. Like other men, I noticed their looks, but it never changed how I treated them. Still, some did stand out to me. Connie Fort was one of them. On the first day, she stood in the front row looking amused, clearly having flown before. She was taller than most, with a neat figure and what seemed like expensive clothes, but it was her hypnotic gray eyes that caught my attention. Cornelia Fort wasn't a classic beauty. She appeared more intelligent than glamorous, with a long, handsome face. Her awareness, strength, and intelligence drew me to her. That's why I asked her to stay after dismissing the others. "You've flown a lot, haven't you?" I asked. She gave me a lazy look and said, "I was an Andrews instructor like you. We were both in the air on December 7th. Wow, this woman had as many flying hours as I did. Did she know the rest of my story?" She added with a hint of disdain, "I assume you and that beautiful woman you were training have split up?" Well, that answered that. I just stood there, stunned. One of my trainees was as experienced as I was, and she knew about Ronnie. That was intimidating. She laughed and said, "Close your mouth, you'll catch flies," then added, "It doesn't matter how much experience I have. I need to get past all the stages to become a Wasp, and you're going to help me." That was how I met Cornelia Fort. Connie seemed quiet and self-contained, making her appear distant, but you could tell there was a lot going on in her mind. She was a force of nature and my best friend. I didn't have any romantic thoughts about her, honestly. Connie was just the only person I truly connected with. Cornelia Fort was a Tennessee aristocrat and acted like it, but she could fit into any group of flyers after hours. Her sarcastic wit made her popular everywhere. Connie read a lot and was a loner like me. I understood her need for solitude. She spent extra hours in the air because it seemed to be the only time she was at peace. She was the best flyer in our group. You had to actually fly with her to see how smooth and in control she was. There were strict rules about relationships between instructors and trainees. Jackie made it clear that even a hint of improper behavior would get both parties kicked out. She already had enough trouble with public opinion. The last thing she needed was a scandal. So there was always a room full of trainees whenever I was with Connie. I got along well with all the trainees. They knew I wanted them to succeed, so they didn't mind me hanging out with them. Women are better than men at spotting anything improper. None thought there was anything between me and Connie other than two people with a lot in common who liked each other. A lack of romance wasn't a problem for me. After my experience with Ronnie, I was off women anyway. Connie and I were true friends, not a couple. Even so, my past with Ronnie was well known, and I felt like I had to clear the air with Connie. We were all sitting outside in the hot Texas night listening to Glenn Miller records. I had dragged an armchair outside and was enjoying a beer. That's when Connie sat in the folding chair next to me. Connie wasn't conventionally pretty, but her face had a nobility that grabbed your attention. I raised my beer in a toast, and she clinked hers against mine. Then we just sat there looking at the big, star-filled Texas sky. I finally said, "I was a different person back then." Connie knew what I meant. She just nodded. I added, "When you're young, you think you're invincible. Then something happens that shows how small you really are. You either learn from it or stay the same." Connie nodded again. I said, "I learned a lot about myself when I lost my arm. My time with Veronica McMartin embarrasses me, but I was only 21 and didn't know how I came across. Being wounded and then dumped makes you look at yourself honestly. So I made a decision. I always knew right from wrong, but I didn't always choose right. Now I see how selfish that was, and I'm a better man because of it. That I promise you." Connie had the most compelling eyes. She stared right into my soul as I finished. She held my gaze for a few seconds, nodded, and said, "Yep." That was all she said, but it felt like a personal thumbs up. I'll never forget it. The next day, I would never forget for a different reason. Maggie Oldenburg was one of the younger Wasp trainees, always cheerful. She and her instructor were practicing stall recovery in a Fairchild PT-19. The problem was, Maggie was the lightest trainee, and her instructor was the heaviest man in the unit. This imbalance caused the plane's center of gravity to shift too far back, leading to a flat spin. In a flat spin, the plane loses forward speed and spins like a leaf, making it uncontrollable. The first sign that something was wrong was the siren. I rushed out of my office to see a plume of smoke rising from the Texas prairie. In that moment, I knew something terrible had happened. Because the Wasps were civilians, there was no funding for Maggie's funeral. Jackie covered all the costs herself. There was a lot of crying and hugging among Maggie's Wasp sisters, something you'd never see in a male training unit. But these women were tough. They didn't miss a minute of flight time, and the loss only made them stronger. Some of my trainees struggled, and 7 didn't make it, but our success rate was good compared to the male cadets training. I was proud to stand with my first graduating class as Jackie and Arnold inspected us. The Wasp program was growing even though it was new. My 16 women earned their silver wings and were sent to different Wasp bases around the country. They took on active service missions, mostly delivering new aircraft from the manufacturer to the depot for overseas deployment. The Wasps had to receive advanced training at their new bases, as there was a significant difference between the planes they had flown before and the ones they would be delivering. They learned to fly different types of aircraft like Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Air Cobras. Each Wasp base delivered different aircraft based on what was made in the area. For example, the Wilmington base delivered P-47 Thunderbolts, while the Romulus base delivered Air Cobras and B-24S. Most deliveries were routine, but there were always dangers like bad weather, fatigue, or human error. In the middle of 1943, we received a large order of Valiants to deliver. Most were going from Long Beach to Dallas Love Field, but 4 were coming to Sweetwater. I took a train to LA to oversee our BT-13 transport. By then, I had been promoted to Base Operations Executive Officer. Besides my instructor duties, I was in charge of new aircraft delivery. Not bad for a 23-year-old with one arm. The BT-13 Valiant was bigger than anything the Wasps had flown before. It was almost the size of a fighter, so we had to familiarize ourselves with the aircraft. On our first morning in LA, we prepared to start the delivery flights, and I ensured my friend Connie was in my flight. We spent that night at the Breakers Hotel, close to the airport. As civilians, the Wasps paid for their own accommodations, but the hotel gave us a discount. 6 of us were sitting in the Sky Room at the Breakers that night. Besides Connie and me, there was Olga Rexroth, a full-blooded Sioux, and Hazel Ying Lee. It sounds like a colorful group, right? Jackie didn't care about your background as long as you could fly. Hazel was older than Connie and me, but looked younger because she was so small. She was an athlete in her younger days and quite the joker. If anyone needed a laugh, Hazel was the one to go to. I remember my first meeting with Hazel. I had scheduled her for an orientation flight in a Fairchild PT-19. After taking off, she was back in 15 minutes, dragging a parachute and looking pleased. I ran out and asked, "What are you doing here? I thought you were on a training flight." Hazel said, "I fell out," and kept dragging her chute to the hangar. I just stood there amazed. That happened to me a lot with those women. Hazel had forgotten to buckle her harness before the flight and fell out at the top of the first loop. Luckily, she was still over the airfield and sitting on her parachute. She floated down safely, becoming the first Wasp to bail out, even if it wasn't on purpose. Hazel's casual way of doing things made her very charming. 2 male Air Service ferry pilots were also sitting with us. They were stationed at Moffett Field near San Francisco and had taken the train down to help with the delivery. There was a young Jewish kid named Goldwater. He was even younger than me and very serious about his first assignment. The other guy was the complete opposite. He was arrogant, full of himself, and always chasing after women. His name was Frank Stamm. He was almost as tall as me and thought he was every woman's dream. Naturally, he was immediately drawn to Connie because Connie was beautiful. Stamm figured out that to impress Connie, he needed to talk about flying. So he dominated the conversation with stories about the men's training program, especially formation flying. He held his hands parallel and said, "You've got to learn how to fly in tight formation to survive in combat." Connie was interested, of course. This was a flying challenge she hadn't yet faced. I tried to make her see sense. None of the Wasps are trained for that. They don't need it to do their job. I had grown a lot from the reckless person I used to be. Sammy sneered and said, "Well, they should learn if they want to play with the big boys." It was nonsense. Sammy was just a ferry pilot who had never seen combat, yet Connie hung on his every word. He then asked her, "Why don't we take a walk down by the beach? I can tell you more about what we learn in Air Service Training School." Yeah, right. As if that was going to happen. Connie might have been naive, but she was a Wasp pilot, not someone for Sammy to hit on. I might have been overprotective. I didn't have romantic feelings for Connie, but we had a special connection. The thought of him getting close to her made me angry. Maybe I did have feelings for her. More importantly, what Sammy was suggesting was risky. Precision flying needed extensive training, and the Wasps weren't prepared for that. Wasp flying groups looked more like a flock of geese, everyone in assigned positions and spread far apart. We called our formations gaggles. Also, I knew Sammy wasn't an expert in formation flying. If he were, he'd be in Europe. I had to stop everyone from getting the wrong idea. I checked my watch and said, "I want you all in your rooms. We have a mission tomorrow, and it's time to sleep." Sammy laughed and said, "You and the rest of the girls can go to bed. Connie and I are going to stay and talk about serious flying." I should have hit him. I regretted not doing it later, but we were in a nightclub surrounded by other trainees. It didn't seem smart. Instead, I said, "I'm in charge of this mission, and I won't let any of you mess it up. We all need sleep now." Then I turned to Sammy and said, "That includes you, flyboy." Sammy was a coward and a blowhard, and he wasn't going to challenge me. I was bigger than him, and he could see in my eyes that I was ready for a fight, but he needed to get the last word. He turned to Connie and said, "We can talk more later, babe. I'll show you how the real men fly." Sadly, he meant it. All of my Wasps had flown the route so many times that it was boring. We reached Tucson for the first overnight stop, as none of the Wasps were trained for night flying. The next morning, we took off from Tucson and landed in Midland, Texas by noon to refuel. In Midland, I saw Connie and Sammy talking at the snack bar. It seemed like they were planning something. I was convinced they were discussing formation flying again. I went over to remind them that close flying was forbidden during delivery flights, but Sammy was still working on Connie, and she hated backing down from a challenge. She was too stubborn for her own good. 45 minutes east of Midland and just south of Sweetwater, I noticed, to my fury, that Connie was trying formation flying. They must have planned it when we refueled. Connie was leading a left echelon stair-step formation with Sammy and then Goldwater. It was incredibly dangerous because they were less than 10 feet apart vertically, and Connie was the only one who looked sure of herself. Connie was flying steadily, but Sammy was struggling with the updrafts from the hot Texas prairie. Or maybe he was just bothering Connie. He kept moving closer and then backing off her left wing. This blatantly ignored my orders. I was about to shout at them over the radio when Sammy moved closer to Connie's plane again. To be safe, Sammy needed to stay 10 feet below and to the left rear of Connie, but his plane drifted. Why? I don't know. Maybe it was a stronger updraft. The air was like ocean waves. Anyway, Sammy's mistake put him at the same altitude as Connie, with his right wingtip just 3 feet from her fuselage. He should have moved carefully down and to his left, but as soon as he saw where he was, he panicked and turned sharply left. He probably expected Connie to turn right. That was what all male pilots were taught to do. The Wasps were not trained to fight because they didn't need to. So Connie stayed in her spot, and Sammy's BT-13 hit her left wing from behind. The front edge of Connie's wing broke off, including the tip. Without a proper wing, Connie's Valiant turned sharply to the left and crashed hard into the desert ground. In that tragic moment, Connie Fort became the first Wasp to die while on duty. The cockpit latches weren't opened, so Connie was probably knocked out when she crashed. She didn't try to escape. Connie was buried next to her father, whom she loved very much. Her gravestone read, "Killed in the service of her country." Flying is risky and people die in wars, that's a fact. But it's sadder to die because of a silly mistake. Connie made a bad call. She thought Sammy was a good pilot, not a show-off, and I lost my best friend, who could have become a close companion because of that wrong belief. The senselessness of Connie's death hit me hard. I'm not embarrassed to say that my tears blurred my vision for the rest of the flight to Sweetwater. Hazel, Olga, and I safely flew the remaining 3 Valiants to our destination. The wreckage of the 4th Valiant was found 10 miles south of Merciless, Texas. Sammy knew he was in deep trouble if I caught him, so he ran to his superiors in the Army. That's why, when I arrived at Love Field, 3 burly military police officers were waiting for me. I spent the rest of my time there searching for him, but they kept him out of my reach. They practically sent me back to Sweetwater in a cage. The official inquiry, as expected, blamed Sammy. But the Army needed pilots, even bad ones like him, so he wasn't punished. I don't know what happened to him later, but I hoped it wasn't good. That boys will be boys attitude lasted until Arnold declared that anyone breaking rules would lose their benefits. Ironic, since the Wasps never got any benefits. Connie's friends had to gather money to send her body home. If you think relying on friends and family to send a fallen soldier home is shameful, well, that's how it was back then. Connie's sudden death drained me completely. It took a long time for me to be useful to the Wasps or even to myself again. I felt like, what's the point? People like me don't meet many others they feel close to, so I wasn't going to find a new friend easily. My arm added to the problem. A woman once told me I disgusted her. That hit my self-esteem and kept me from getting close to any woman romantically. My love life from puberty to 23 years old was a series of failures to connect. I thought Susan could be someone I could bond with. She understood me and shared my values, but she was already with someone else. As sad as it sounds, even Ronnie might have been the one. We shared interests, but she liked pork a lot. Her leaving me ended up being a good thing, yet it also made me distrust women. Connie was different. She was open and honest, not mysterious. But she was taken from me by someone's arrogance, leaving me empty inside. I wasn't doing the main job of the Wasps, which was ferrying, but I knew target towing was the most dangerous. The planes were old and had many problems. That's how Mabel Rawlinson died. Mabel's plane had engine trouble as she tried to return to base. It didn't clear the pine trees and crashed, trapping her in the burning wreck. Everyone heard her screams. The inquiry found the plane was in bad shape and was given the wrong fuel. Mistakes happen in war, and life is fragile, but seriously, that was too much. The Wasps were brave and dedicated. Everyone who knew them recognized that, but they faced a lot of unfair hatred. For example, one Wasp was pulling a target for anti-aircraft gunners to shoot at when they missed, and the Wasp flew back. The leader of the gunning group muttered, "Hell, they missed the girl." That was the attitude the Wasps dealt with every day. Seeing such clear bias made me lose the usual dreams of a 23-year-old. It was only my duty to the Wasps that kept me from falling apart. Routine and predictability were my lifelines. Paperwork and flying were my only companions. I felt alone and miserable. Then everything suddenly changed again. I saw my interactions with women as separate rooms, not a continuous line. I would leave one room and enter a completely new setup. Once I closed the door on an old relationship, it was like it never happened. Susan was just a teenage crush, easy to leave behind. My relationship with Ronnie was heated but shallow. It hurt when she left, but I closed that door and moved on. Connie and I had a strong bond, but she had passed away. Now, standing in another room, I felt a vague sense of familiarity. My mind went back to the day I met the Wasp class 43-6. It was another hot, sunny day in Texas. The weather there was always either blazing sun or heavy rain. We still followed strict military rules because the Wasps didn't know yet that they would remain civilians. The new trainees were lined up in something like military order. I knew I couldn't yell at these women the same way I would with male trainees, yet I tried to look tough as I walked along the line of recruits. I felt like a rock inside, showing no emotions. While walking, I caught sight of a pair of big blue eyes. Surprises don't usually happen in routine tasks, so I almost didn't react. But then my brain fully registered those eyes and I stopped. Could it be? I turned back to the owner of those eyes, which made a stir among the other instructors. The girls called me the old man, even though I was only 23. It seemed like I was about to do something unexpected. I looked at the woman who stood there with a half smile and a concerned look. She was doing her best to stand at attention. I said, "See me after recruit," and finished the inspection. When we were done, she came over to me. I gave her a confused but happy smile and asked, "What are you doing here?" With a playful tone, she said, "It's all your fault. You got me into flying." That took me back to a simpler time when death was just a word. Susan Lawson had been the most beautiful girl I knew. Over 2 years, she had grown into a stunning woman, her hair still pulled up like dog ears. "I already paid for the lessons," she said. "When my parents found out, they tried to stop me. Jack was furious about me flying with you, but I wanted to do it." She paused. "It was the first time I did something just for me, and I loved it." Susan gave me a meaningful look. "I did call you after a month when things calmed down. I called, but your parents said you had left. It sounded like you had a hard time with them." I felt a pang of sadness. If I had known Susan was reachable, things might have been different. But I was impulsive back then. Hurting my parents and ending up in Hawaii on December 7th wasn't planned, but that was all in the past. "So how did you get here?" I asked. She looked far away and said, "Patriotism." I understood. It had changed me from a self-centered child into a man. For Susan, patriotism wasn't about showing off. It meant honor, duty, and service. It meant putting the greater good above personal gain and being ready to make sacrifices. Susan was perfect for the tough and dangerous role of a wasp. But still, how did she end up here? Last time I saw her, she was homecoming queen, destined for a comfortable life in the suburbs. How did she become someone ready for the hard life of a wasp? "It all started with our first flight together and the lessons I took," she began. "How many flight hours do you have?" I asked. She hesitated. "I have 450 flight hours and a multi-engine rating, so the Wasps asked me to join. They need bomber pilots." I was shocked. "How did you get that rating? I don't even have one." Susan looked a bit embarrassed. "Mr. Northanger, an executive at American Airlines, helped me. His son was on our soccer team. Once I got my license and my dad saw I was serious, he introduced me to Mr. Northanger." I motioned for her to continue. She sighed, like explaining to a child. "After the war began, the military took most of American Airlines' male pilots. They needed pilots badly, so Mr. Northanger got me a job as a flight engineer on their DC-3S. Then in mid-42, their staff shortage got worse. With my commercial flying experience and ATP certificate, they made me a co-pilot on regular flights. I could hardly believe it. Susan, flying a twin-engine passenger plane as a commercial pilot, was mind-blowing. She was my teenage crush, the popular girl at school, admired by everyone who assumed she would marry Jack Lamberts. The war had changed a lot of things for women. I finally asked the only question I really cared about. "So, what happened to Jack?" Susan frowned. "He's in the past. When Pearl Harbor happened, Jack's dad got him a job as a congressional aide, so he got a draft exemption like most rich kids did. He quickly wanted to make me his pretty wife, but I couldn't see myself just going to fancy parties and baking cookies while a war was happening." I felt relieved. The Susan telling this story was the Susan I knew and loved. Susan laughed. "It didn't end well for either of us. One night he got drunk and tried to break into my house. He thought he could take me, but I had him arrested. Then I was shunned by polite society because I pressed charges. You know how Georgetown is?" Susan mimicked an old woman's voice. "Proper young women don't press charges just because a man assaults them. It's so scandalous." She looked annoyed. So I moved to Chicago, where the American DC-3 passenger service starts from, and joined the Wasps when they recruited me. There it was. Susan had followed the path from student to licensed pilot, got her specialty, and flew enough hours to be considered. It was also no surprise that we would meet again. All the Wasps went through the same training, no matter how experienced. So Susan and I were bound to meet again as soon as she signed the contract. Now my first and only true love was standing in front of me, looking like she expected me to say something. It made me very uncomfortable because I could hear my superior's voice telling me that fraternization was forbidden, even in situations like ours. "I can only tell you this once," I said. "You know the rules about fraternization, and I don't want either of us kicked out of the Wasps. But I have never forgotten you, and if things were different, I would ask you to be my girl right now." I added with hope, I promise we have a future once the war is over. But for now, you are the trainee, and I am your XO. Can you live with that?" Susan's face lit up. It was like this was exactly what she wanted to hear. She said, "You will never have a reason to doubt me as a trainee or as your friend." I added sadly, "Before you promise anything, though, there's something you need to know about me." I had to do it, even though I knew it might end things. I rolled up my left sleeve and Susan gasped at what she saw. I unstrapped the prosthetic arm and slipped the sleeve off my stump, revealing my amputated arm. Tears welled up in her eyes and she began to cry. I hadn't expected that. It told me all I needed to know. She was disgusted by the arm. Of course she was. Who wouldn't be? I looked around, worried, hoping nobody saw us. Susan's reaction was odd for two supposed strangers, and it could get us in trouble. I was just about to give up all my hopes when Susan said, "Oh, Eric, that's heartbreaking. How did it happen? Does it hurt?" I replied, embarrassed. "I was hurt in the first 15 minutes of the war. A shell took off my left arm. I know how gross it looks, and I understand how you feel. I know I'm repulsive to women." Susan looked shocked. "I can't believe you said that. You are so much more than one missing arm. You are tall, handsome, and my guy. That is if you'll have me." "Was that a choir of angels?" I said, heartfelt. "You're beautiful, capable, and strong. Any man would want you. I can't believe you have feelings for me. But I promise if you accept me, even though I'm damaged, you will have my total devotion, even if I'm missing some parts." A reunion on the tarmac of a busy airport was a strange way for Susan Lawson and me to come back together. But the war had made us grown-ups, and our bond was real. Wasp Class 43. 6 went on the usual track. There were fewer failures since it was harder to become a Wasp. Susan and I had the same relationship I had with Connie, non-romantic. We hung out with the other Wasp trainees, and nobody saw anything but a trainer-recruit relationship. But this time, there were deeper feelings. There was a difference between deep friendship and love. Both involve respect and considering the other's feelings. Love adds the desire to be physically close, and both Susan and I wanted more than friendship. Even so, any romantic relationship we could have had to be put aside. Susan was ethical and wanted to be a Wasp. I saw my duties with the Wasps as a sacred trust, more than any personal desire. Neither of us wanted to lose that. Still, it didn't stop us from small expressions of affection that lovers have. And it was definitely love at that point. Every guy knows a woman like Susan. She's the one all the other guys want to date and the one all the girls want to be. But being the most popular girl in high school is more about looks than who you really are. I had only known the teenage beauty. I saw the true person at last, and she was wonderful. Because of Susan's time flying the DC-3, she was in a special group training to fly bombers. Bomber pilots needed to learn how to control planes using electric motors, gears, and hydraulics. So instead of flying our AT-6 Texans, Susan always flew our twin-engine Cessna AT-17 Bobcat. The Bobcat could hold up to 3 extra people, meaning several trainees could fly together and take turns. Seeing 4 women walk confidently across the runway, all wearing leather A4 jackets with a Fifanella patch on their left chest and their parachutes over their shoulders, chatting and laughing, showed the true spirit and friendship of the Wasps. But these brave women all knew the dangers. This made me finally tell Susan that I loved her. What pushed me was a telegram I received saying Hazel Ying Lee had died the night before. Hazel was in Detroit delivering P-39 Aerocobras and P-63 King Cobras from the Bell factory in Niagara Falls, New York. These planes went to Great Falls, Montana, where they were sent to the Russians. The Russians liked the P-63 because its 37mm cannon was great at destroying tanks. Russian pilots would take them from Great Falls to Russia through Alaska. U.S. pilots, however, were glad to see them go, thinking good riddance. Hazel had delivered King Cobras many times, but a snowstorm at Great Falls caused confusion in the tower. Hazel was cleared to land at the same time as another P-63, causing a collision that took her life. I read the telegram from Jackie while Susan and I were at a party for her class's graduation. Even though Susan and I sat close together, the other girls didn't mind. They guessed what was going on, but there was nothing to see. I hadn't shown any favoritism. Susan was a great pilot who took flying seriously. After reading the telegram, I covered my face to hide my tears. Susan, worried, asked, "Eric, what's wrong?" I kept my head down, not wanting her to see me cry, and said, "We lost another Wasp last night. Hazel was a joker sometimes, but she was a good pilot and a great friend." Susan responded, "Oh, Eric, I'm so sorry, but she died serving her country, which is very noble." I said, "It's not Hazel's death that upsets me. You're going to face the same danger soon, and I can't bear losing you." I hesitated, feeling this was a reckless thing to say, and continued, "I love you, Susan Lawson." She gasped and seemed to melt into me, then hugged me and whispered, "I love you too, Eric. I've loved you for a long time." That was it. Just a quiet embrace. We quickly moved apart before anyone noticed and returned to the conversation around our little fire. But we knew we had made a lifetime promise. I was flying less because I had to manage operations, but Susan's instructors were so impressed that they suggested I send her to the Wasps' Wilmington base. This base delivered the B-26 Marauder, a tough plane to land that had caused many crashes. The B-26 was known as the Widowmaker because of its powerful engines and small wings, which meant you had to land it at high speed to avoid stalling. I was worried about sending Susan to Wilmington because I had lost one soulmate already, and the B-26 was dangerous. When I expressed my concern to Susan, she got very mad. "I didn't join the Wasps for you to protect me. Flying freed me from my parents, and serving my country makes me who I am, an independent woman. You won't take that away from me by keeping me safe here." I understood Susan had worked hard against expectations to become who she was. If I truly loved her, I had to let her face danger. That's the thing about honor and duty. They're not convenient and can be heartbreaking. So I felt deep despair as I watched Susan leave in one of our Bobcats. Two other Wasps from her class, Dorothea Johnson and Dee Dee Mormon, went with her. They flew to the Newcastle Army Air Base at Wilmington, and Jackie would fly the Bobcat back to Sweetwater. This was surprising and made me uneasy because Jackie was coming to Sweetwater specifically to talk to me. I waited nervously on the tarmac as the Bobcat arrived. Jackie, looking bright and cheerful, hopped down from the plane. I thought, oh, she wants something. We had a small room with a big coffee pot on a hot plate. Without saying anything, Jackie motioned me into the room, grabbed a cup of black coffee, and said, "Sit down, Eric." I followed her to a couple of old wing chairs in the far corner. It was where most of us went for a short nap. It gave a bit of privacy. Jackie took a sip of her boiling hot coffee and looked really happy. It seemed like she couldn't feel pain. Then she gave me a commanding look, the kind that made you do exactly what she wanted. I waited, nervous, as Jackie said, "The Wasps were promised military status and benefits. It's time for this country to keep that promise. I've told Hap Arnold that he either brings the Wasps into the military or I'm going to shut down the entire program." I gasped. "Shut down the Wasps?" Jackie, showing her determination, said, "The Whacks and Waves have been part of the U.S. military since early 1942. None of them have been killed in action, but we have lost over 30 Wasps in active service, and they haven't gotten the military status and benefits their sisters have." I hadn't thought about that before, and it made me very angry. I shouted, "That's a disgrace to our nation. We must do whatever it takes to get military benefits for the Wasps." Yes, I know. I had just walked into a trap. I wasn't sharp when it came to being tricked. Jackie pounced. She said, "The House of Representatives is working on a bill to make the Wasps a military organization like the Whacks, Waves, and Spars." I said cautiously, "That's nice, but why are you talking to me?" This seemed very suspicious. Jackie smiled a smile you couldn't refuse and said, "You know many people in the government thanks to your dad's job at the Treasury, and you've been with the Wasps since the start. You're a well-known Wasp instructor and administrator, so I'm going to assign you to Hap Arnold as an official go-between for the Wasps." Jackie continued, "You will need the right status to deal with all the big egos in Washington, so I'm making you my chief of staff. You'll be in charge of Wasp operations and act as my go-between with the AAF and Congress." Jackie added, "This would do two important things. First, it would bring justice to the Wasps. Second, it would put someone I trust close to Arnold. Arnold wants a woman colonel to head the military Wasps. Who would be better for that job than me?" Jackie was smart and ambitious. She knew that having me next to Arnold would help her chances to get that job. But DC politics is dangerous. If I wasn't careful, I could get badly hurt. Why would I take on such a big challenge? Maybe because I would be just 2 hours away from Susan instead of 2 days away in Sweetwater. Susan's leaving hit me much harder than Connie's loss. I was desperate to be close to her. Jackie was still talking. She said, "I know I can make this work with Hap if you promise to manage both jobs." She meant doing her paperwork and pushing her agenda in Congress. For me, being near Susan was worth any risk of working for Jackie, so I said gratefully, "I won't let you down." Jackie gave me a big smile and added, "And say hello to your friend Susan Lawson for me. I heard she's delivering planes in Wilmington now." That woman never missed a thing in DC. Nothing happened without someone getting something in return, and now I was Jackie's man, bought with the promise of being close to Susan. Jackie must have loved it when a plan came together. The next week, I found myself in the office of Lieutenant General Hap Arnold in the newly built Pentagon across the Potomac in Alexandria. Hap was a leader in aviation, holding the 29th pilot license and being the second American military pilot, only because he lost a coin toss. He was a protege of Billy Mitchell and the right guy to lead the Army Air Force in World War II. So there I was, dressed in my best Wasp uniform, as I was shown into Arnold's office in the E-ring. I had bought the outfit myself because there was no uniform allowance for the Wasps, but my parents had money, and they were proud of me. I looked like a real military aviation officer, even though I was actually part of a civilian volunteer group, mostly made up of women. By December 1943, the Wasps wore a Santiago blue wool uniform with a gold Wasp pin and a small pair of winged propellers on each collar. The silver pilot's wings with a central shield were worn on the left chest, the shield looking like the one carried by Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom and war. The AAF patch was on the shoulder. There was no rank badge because we were civilians. I wore the uniform with pride because I knew those women were making a huge contribution to the war effort. By that point in the war, 1,074 Wasp pilots had flown 60 million miles and delivered 13,000 aircraft. This allowed 900 male pilots to go overseas for combat duty. If you're keeping count, that's like having 38 full squads of pilots or 13 combat wings. This was almost the same as the manpower of the entire 8th and 9th Air Forces combined. Since those two forces bombed Hitler heavily, the Wasp's contribution was very important. It made a big difference. Arnold was one of the few high-ranking officers who believed that the only thing that mattered was if you could do the job. Eisenhower and MacArthur thought the same way, but that kind of thinking required a wide view of the world. Most people in the Pentagon, however, had prejudices about women in the military, similar to how they felt about race in small towns in Mississippi. Arnold was known for being friendly, which is why he had that nickname. But he greeted me with a harsh, "Sit down." So I sat. He looked at me with dislike. I didn't understand why until I realized that my Wasp uniform made him think I was one of those rich kids who avoided the draft and liked pretending to be a hero. So I politely asked, "May I take off my coat?" Hap made a go-ahead gesture and kept glaring at me. Once my coat was off, I rolled up the sleeve of my left arm past my elbow. Arnold's eyes popped out, and his attitude completely changed. Curiously, he asked, "Where did you lose the arm?" "I was probably the first flyer injured in the attack on Pearl Harbor," I replied. "I was in the air when the Japanese showed up. They got me on the ground after I landed." Arnold asked, "Were you with the 15th or 18th Pursuit? Those were the fighter groups at Pearl Harbor." "Neither," I said. "I was a civilian teacher. My student made it to the hangar, but they shot me just before I got to safety." I added, "Jackie gave me a job with the Wasps. They didn't mind a one-armed pilot. I was the deputy at Sweetwater, but because Jackie wants the Wasp military bill passed, and I know many people here in D.C., she thought I might be useful as an advisor to you." Arnold said, "I like your attitude, kid. What are you, 28? 29? 24, almost 25, I proudly replied. Arnold laughed and said, "We need all the young energy we can get. That is if we want to do right by your Wasps. There's a lot of opposition to the Wasps among the male pilots, and John Costello is having a hard time getting support for his bill." That was a smart observation. But then again, you have to be both a politician and a strong leader to get to Arnold's level. I said, most of the opposition is due to ignorance. One thing I can do is talk to people about the Wasp program from my own experience and explain all the benefits they provide. I added eagerly, Jackie has based me here in D.C. now, so as soon as you allow me, I'm ready to start speaking for the Wasps on Capitol Hill. And that's how I became a sort of lobbyist for the Wasps. The war went on into 1944, and a few more brave women died doing their duty. The Wasps were almost fully responsible for delivering the high-performance planes going overseas, which increased the chances of fatal accidents. But the Wasps kept going despite mechanical failures and bad weather. It wasn't just the new Wasps who died during that time. The loss of Evelyn Sharp affected me the most because she was one of the originals and a friend of both Connie and me. Evelyn was also one of the best pilots in the country, male or female. One day, the engine of the twin-engine P-38 Lightning that Evelyn Sharp was delivering failed right after takeoff. With almost any other pilot, the force from the still-running engine would have flipped the Lightning over, but Evelyn skillfully pushed the rudder hard to counter the loss of the engine and turned the plane back to the field, where she landed it with the wheels up. The plane wasn't badly damaged, but the impact broke Evelyn's neck. The crash truck guy said it looked like she was sleeping. Evelyn died in early April 1944 while I was trying to win the support of a bunch of middle-aged men who had never risked their lives. They say that power corrupts. If you have it, you want to keep it. And the only way to do that is by making your supporters happy. We're talking about the lowest common level here, not the best and brightest. The Wasps were a big issue in American society because of powerful male pilots. Plus, American voters didn't like the idea of strong, independent women. So most members of the House of Representatives saw no reason to support the Wasps. They could see that the Wasps cost money, which was right there in the budget. But the real impact of losing them was too hard for the average congressman to understand. Shutting down the Wasps would mean the Air Force had to train almost 800 new ferry pilots at 3 times the cost of the current Wasp budget. More importantly, the Wasps already had 2 years of experience that couldn't be replaced. This training gap would stop the delivery of new planes for 6 months while the male pilots were trained. Then the delivery process would have to start from scratch. Even though the Wasp pilots had the needed experience, the program's legitimacy was under fire. Headlines like, "Not created by Congress," popped up in newspapers across the country. Of course, the military would be ineffective if every unit had to be approved by lawmakers. But that didn't matter to a politician trying to get reelected in small-town America. All I could do was try to explain the benefits of the Wasp program to each congressman, hoping the bill to make the Wasps part of the military would pass in the House. I worked on it day and night, mostly at night, because that's when you take important people out for pricey dinners. Despite our hard work, the bill, H.R. 4219, was defeated by 19 votes on June 21, 1944, and the outcome was clear. Congress had approved funding for the next year, but Jackie and Arnold decided to close the program right away. For Jackie, it was either full military status or nothing. Too many brave women had already died hoping for recognition. Now that this promise was broken, Jackie couldn't ask her Wasps to risk their lives anymore. Jackie's Wasps would have done it willingly because that's who they were. But sometimes a leader has to make decisions for the good of everyone. Jackie did the right thing, what anyone with a heart would have done. As for me, I felt more disillusioned. The only reason I had put up with all this was to be close to Susan. She was thrilled I was nearby. I hadn't seen her since she left Sweetwater. We wrote to each other, sharing as much detail as we could despite the censors, but I was busy with lobbying in D.C., so we hadn't met up yet. When the vote result came in, I told Jackie I was taking some time off to visit a friend. We were officially a civilian agency now, and government workers get vacations. I didn't even call Susan. I just hopped in my Ford, the one we had our first date in, and drove the 2 hours to Newcastle Air Base. Newcastle was 7 miles south of Wilmington on the Delaware River. It was a bright, sunny day. I had the top down and Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing playing on the radio. As I drove up to the base entrance, the guard was going to give me a hard time until I showed him my ID, signed by Hap Arnold himself. That changed his mind. I asked, "Where is the Wasp base?" He pointed to a cinder block building across the runway. I drove there and walked into the busy operations center. The Newcastle Wasps were also doing target towing along with deliveries. The big board with all the assignments was full of familiar names. Dee Dee Mormon was standing near the door smoking, and she gave me a nervous glance. I asked, "Where's Susan?" Her glance became even more uneasy. "Is she on a delivery?" I asked. Dee Dee looked cautious and said, "She's out to lunch right now. She should be back in 45 minutes. "I'll wait," I said, and sat down. Dee Dee seemed really nervous. "Susan's with somebody. I can't tell you who." Old feelings of insecurity swirled inside me, but I stayed calm and said, "That's nice." Inside, my mind was shouting, I just knew it. This always seemed to happen to me. Dee Dee avoided more conversation until the door opened. Susan Lawson walked in, looking stunning. She was followed by a good-looking man who had clearly seen combat. Susan was laughing at something he said, and my jealousy flared. Dee Dee stopped her at the door. They whispered for a moment, and my heart sank. Then Susan turned, saw me, and her face lit up with joy. Susan rushed over and hugged me, easing my jealousy a bit. Maybe the big secret was military. Susan didn't introduce her companion right away. Instead, he walked over and stood there while Susan kissed me warmly. Finally, she pulled back and, smiling, said, "This is Colonel Paul Tibbets. He just made me an offer I can't turn down." I hoped it wasn't a marriage proposal. Anyone who has read history knows who Paul Tibbets is now, but back then, he was just a famous war hero. He offered me his hand, and I shook it, but I sensed there was something I needed to know. I'm not the type to let suspicion grow, so I turned to Susan and said, "Spill it. I know something's up. Tell me what it is." Susan looked at Tibbets, and he nodded with a smile. Beaming, Susan said, "Colonel Tibbets just asked Dee Dee and me to fly the B-29. I had no idea what a B-29 was, so I said, trying not to sound annoyed, "I can tell from the B that it's a bomber, but I've never seen or heard about one by that name." Tibbets stepped in and said, "The B-29's development has been kept top secret because it's going to win the war. We finished testing last year, and Boeing is now making more of them to get ready for combat." He paused and added, "I'm in charge of that program, and I wanted a couple of Wasps to deliver the first one. It's going to get a lot of media attention. It will be a ceremonial flight from the base at Eglin to White Sands. And these two," he nodded toward Susan and Dee Dee, "were chosen from all the Marauder pilots. Oh, what an honor. The love of my life, the girl I gave her first plane ride to, was going to fly a big 4-engine bomber without any training. That was truly a great achievement, and I was proud of her. But I had been around the aviation business long enough to know Tibbets wasn't telling the whole truth. Still, Tibbets was the only one in the room who knew what he wasn't sharing. The part Tibbets didn't tell us was that several factors, including the B-29's advanced design, tough performance needs, and the huge push to get it into use, had created a plane no sane pilot wanted to fly. Less than a year earlier, the prototype had even killed Boeing's chief test pilot, Edmund Allen. The problem was with the engines. They often caught fire at bad times, killing the crew. Fixing that issue took most of late 1943 and early 1944. Boeing thought it had fixed the fire problem by replacing the weak Wright Cyclone engines with Pratt & Whitney, R4360S. Major fixes were happening for the 15 B-29S they had. Now someone had to prove the fix worked. That's what Tibbets had in mind for Susan and Dee Dee. It was a cold and cynical move. The people in charge figured the best way to make male bomber crews accept the new plane was to shame them by having a couple of Wasps deliver it. See how easy and safe it is? Even a woman can do it. You get the idea. Of course, not telling the women that the plane had a long record of deadly crashes, Allen's plane had even damaged part of Seattle, might be a bit heartless. But I guessed Susan would have volunteered anyway. It would have been over my dead body, but Susan believed the Tree of Liberty sometimes needed the sacrifice of patriots. Tibbets solved that moral problem by not telling me or Susan that the real goal of the flight was to prove the B-29 was safe. He also didn't train Susan or Dee Dee on important facts, like the need to quickly increase speed after takeoff to avoid engine problems. But Tibbets wanted to make sure the plan worked. He knew if two women who weren't trained could fly a B-29, then any male pilot who refused would look bad. It was a clever trick. The woman I wanted to be with might be put at risk for the military's plans, but America was going to drop the A-bomb, and only the superfortress could do it. So we all had to do what was needed to make that happen. Luckily, neither of us knew any of that. Susan thought it was a special delivery flight, and I was so focused on our relationship that I wasn't thinking about anything else. I knew the Wasp program would end soon, and Susan wasn't a trainee anymore, so our relationship wasn't against the rules. More importantly, Jackie approved of us being together, so it was time to talk about our future. The B-29 delivery was set for 3 weeks from that day, and Susan didn't need to be at Eglin until the following week. I had told Jackie I wasn't coming back until Monday, and the June weather was great, so I booked us a weekend room at the Inn at Montchanin, a historic hotel 10 miles northwest of the base. The Montchanin Inn is kept up by I. Dupont de Nemours and Company, known to most people as just DuPont. Needless to say, there's money around. The place had everything I wanted: luxurious, quiet, and private. I was making more money than I ever imagined, so I could afford to splurge. At that point, I had known Susan for 4 years. Was it only 4 years? It felt like forever. During that time, we had held hands and shared 3 modest kisses. That was our love life. But that was about to change. I was no longer Susan's trainer, and the Wasp program was ending. It was time to add the final element to our committed relationship: physical closeness. And it was as much Susan's idea as it was mine. Susan was still wearing her flight overalls, which the Wasps called zoot suits. As I opened the door to our elegant room, her flight attire underscored how eager we were when we left the base. As soon as I closed the door, Susan gave me a playful look and slowly unzipped her overalls, letting them fall to the floor. She stood there in her bra and panties, her round, well-shaped body and long legs shown to me for the first time. She smiled warmly and asked, "Do you like it?" I remembered my response the first time she asked me that. "God, yes," I replied, but this time I knew what was coming next. I hurriedly took off my uniform, pants, shirt, and shoes. The only thing left was what I feared most: my artificial arm. The prosthetic arm looked strange by itself. Now Susan was going to see and touch the stump. I undid the straps and, with hesitation, slipped off the leather sleeve, revealing my amputation. The surgeon had folded strips of skin over, making it look like the end of a sausage. After 3 years, my skin looked normal, but there were clear scars where the skin grafts joined. I looked at Susan with pleading eyes, hoping she wouldn't be too shocked by my deformity, but she gazed at my arm with nothing but love and care. Then she took my left arm and gently kissed the end of it. Lying back, she said with more emotion than her words suggested, "I know your wound matters to you, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." She laughed happily and added, "You are kind, caring, a great pilot, and a wonderful man. Let's get to what we came here for. I can't wait any longer." Her kind and loving gesture brought tears to my eyes as I lay down beside her. I took a moment to take in her beautiful body. Susan's perfect shape struck me. Her neck was graceful yet strong, and her shoulders were broad but still delicate. Her breasts were full but perfectly proportional to her body. Her stomach was flat, and her hips were wide, with muscle definition visible. Susan's legs were truly amazing. Long, smooth, and strong, with clearly defined muscles. Her lower legs were a bit longer than average, giving her the look of a graceful young horse. Her beauty ended in a dainty pair of feet with bright red toenails. I looked at Susan's face, glowing with affection, and said simply and sincerely, "I love you." She whispered, "I love you too." Then our lips met for our first serious kiss. Susan's mouth opened to welcome my exploring tongue, and we were lost in each other for what felt like hours. Susan and I parted ways on Monday morning. She was flying one of our 86S down to Eglin, and I caught a C-47 from Andrews all the way to Alamogordo in New Mexico. The flight from D.C. to Holloman AFB took almost a day. For months, there had been a lot of traffic between D.C. and that area, which was mostly desert and rattlesnakes. I found out later it was because of the Manhattan Project. For me, catching a ride on a C-47 was just an easy way to get where I needed to be. I had to play the role Jackie planned for me. I was representing the Wasps, and it felt like their last big moment. I dressed the part of Wasp Chief of Staff in my best Santiago blue uniform. Jackie said I was her stand-in, so I was treated like an important person. Jackie knew what Susan's real job was, to make male pilots accept the B-29. It was a chance to show how much the Wasps had helped in the war. Jackie also knew it was possible Susan and Dee Dee might not make it. But Jackie, who raced against top male pilots, was willing to take that risk. My job was to make sure everyone, especially the press, knew 2 Wasps were flying the plane. This was to be the most visible proof of their help during the war. I wanted everyone who argued against the Wasps to see what they were losing. It was a hot day in the Jornada del Muerto desert, 110 degrees and not a cloud in the sky. The landscape was empty, with mountains far away. I regretted wearing my wool uniform, but I was there to guide the Wasps when they arrived. If they didn't, their flight record would be hidden for 50 years. Holloman supported the White Sands testing range in Alamogordo, so it had a big airport even in the desert. The runways were long and the facilities were impressive. The venue was set up with VIP seating for congressmen and Air Force top brass, the folks there to soak up attention and endure the heat. Reporters hovered around the perimeter like curious birds, eager for a story. My task was clear: make sure America knew 2 Wasps were flying the plane. I moved to the edge of the area, and reporters flocked around me like pigeons. The B-29 was a secret because the Air Force believed it was crucial to the bombing campaign. It was much larger than the B-17, with a longer body and wider wings, giving it 3 times the range of a B-17. More importantly, the B-29 could carry 10 tons of bombs, compared to the B-17's 2.5 tons. This was critical because our atomic bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, weighed 5 tons each. Despite the B-29's reputation for engine fires, Susan's flight aimed to settle those doubts. True or not, I only cared that Susan and Dee Dee's arrival would prove Wasps could do the job, even if male pilots wouldn't. I couldn't reveal the real reason for this grand show, so I used my brief interview to praise the brave women. I didn't mention that their efforts would end in 6 months. Announcing such bad news would have been a crime, at least to the high-ranking Air Force officials present. Susan was supposed to arrive at 11 o'clock Alamogordo time. As 11:30 approached with no sign of her, the tension mounted. We couldn't track the flight, but we could hear the ATC chatter on loudspeakers. Time dragged on until, finally, I heard Susan's voice crackle over the radio, asking for landing clearance. I didn't know I could hold my breath that long. 2 thoughts hit me simultaneously. She made it, and I pictured her focused face from 4 years ago. A shiny silver plane appeared in the distance. If the B-17 was an eagle, the B-29 looked like a giant condor. It was the biggest plane I had ever seen, gleaming in the hot New Mexico sun. Susan was at 2,000 feet, flying the B-29 past the crowd and turning over the desert. Her calm voice on the radio showed she was in control. The B-29 looked more like a spaceship than a plane, with a round nose and a long metal tube with a glass front instead of a big cockpit. Susan had a clear view of the runway as she approached. The wheels came down, and a puff of blue smoke showed as the tires hit the runway. The plane slowed down, and I saw the big Pfeiffer art on the nose, signaling the Wasps had arrived. Susan and Dee Dee parked the plane and exited professionally, treating it like a normal day at work. The 10 men in the crew, mostly enlisted guys, disembarked first, using different exits. The 2 Wasps, the stars of the show, came out last to loud cheers from the crowd of dignitaries and reporters. Army PR had them stand in front of the plane for photos, a humbling moment with 8 big men and 2 small women in the middle. One of them, the love of my life. An Air Force PR guy tried to steer the 2 Wasps to meet the officers. That's when I stepped in. "Get lost, buddy. This is a Wasp operation, not yours." Susan looked surprised. "I didn't know you would be here." We didn't hug or kiss. We both stayed professional. I smiled. "I was on your first flight. Do you think I'd miss your big moment?" The PR guy sneered. "Go back and play with the rest of the girls." Colonel Tibbets, who was on the flight, saw what was coming. He stepped in before I could throw a punch. "Stand down, Lieutenant. These women are Wasps." Tibbets was smart. He knew a fight would ruin everything. The rest of the day went as Tibbets planned. Susan and Dee Dee gave a talk to the male pilots. Susan was beautiful and a great pilot, so you can imagine how well it went. I stayed on the edges to ensure the two women got the respect they deserved. Some called me that Wasp guard. If it fits, it fits. Susan and Dee Dee spent a couple of weeks at Holloman flying B-29S with different crews. They received a lot of praise for their skills. Then the top brass discovered two women were flying the B-29 prototype and almost had a meltdown. One high-ranking officer even said, "Those women are making the big football players look bad." Jackie and I spent the last 5 months of the Wasp program wrapping things up. The final day was December 20th, 1944, when the last class of Wasp trainees graduated. They got their silver wings but would never serve in the military. However, there was one last part to our story, involving a very unique woman, Gertrude Tommy Tompkins. When she was young, Tommy had a bad stutter and was very shy. Her wealthy parents sent her to live on a family farm, hoping it would help. Instead, she developed a deep love for goats. Tommy might have lived a quiet life if not for an American pilot. By her mid-20s, Tommy had grown into a beautiful, slim, dark-haired woman. Despite her stutter, a pilot swept her off her feet. Tragically, he died flying with the RAF in Europe, prompting Tommy to join the Wasps at Sweetwater. Tommy kept to herself because of her stutter, but her exceptional piloting skills got her into advanced pursuit school, the top gun of its time. She learned to fly the P-38 Lightning and the P-51 Mustang. Miraculously, after her first P-51 flight, Tommy's stutter disappeared. Perhaps the confidence she gained from flying America's best fighter plane played a role. Freed from her stutter, Tommy found love again and married Army Technical Sergeant Henry Silver. The marriage was unusual and later raised questions. Silver had known Tommy for years before they married, and most people thought Tommy was still mourning her first love. Yet suddenly they got married, and Tommy returned to duty without her wedding ring or using her married name. Wasp rules frowned on marriage, so Tommy might have feared losing her job. Her secret marriage and odd behavior later added to the mystery of her disappearance. I got involved with Tommy on Halloween 1944. I was at the Pentagon talking to General Arnold about shutting down the Wasp program when he received an urgent phone call. It had to be serious. Arnold listened and then handed me the phone. It was Jackie, sounding frantic. "I need you in Los Angeles now. We have a problem." Confused, I asked what the problem was, but she just said, "Get to Mines Field ASAP," and hung up. Arnold, as puzzled as I was, said he'd get me on the next flight. 12 hours later, tired and rumpled, I was talking to an upset officer at Mines on Thursday, October 26th. 40 Wasps were at Mines Field to fly P-51Ds to Newark, New Jersey. They planned to stop in Tucson that night, as Wasps couldn't fly after dark. If they didn't leave by 3:18 p.m., they'd have to stay in Palm Springs. Timing was crucial to figuring out what happened to Tommy. Tommy had to stop or take off and move to the side of the runway because of a bent door. The P-51D plane she flew had a clear top cover, so the problem was likely with the latch that held it shut. Mechanics worked on the plane briefly, and then inspectors cleared it. But it was too late to make the 3:18 deadline. Tommy told the mechanic she would stay overnight in Palm Springs. That caused some confusion. 2 days passed before anyone realized that Tommy had not shown up anywhere. She had vanished completely. And that's why I was in LA trying to figure out what had happened. Everyone had their own ideas. The most believable theory was that the latch problem reoccurred as Tommy was taking off. The P-51D was a tough plane to fly, and if the cover suddenly opened in bad weather, it could have distracted Tommy enough to crash into Santa Monica Bay. Someone said they saw something like that happen. Another idea was that Tommy decided to start a new life and disappeared. Or maybe she chose to end her life. But suicide was ruled out because Tommy had everything going for her. Perhaps she just wanted a fresh start without her new husband and her speech problems. No one really knows. What we do know is that Tommy Tompkins is the only woman declared missing in action during World War II. For me, the mystery of Tommy Tompkins didn't last long. 3 days after I arrived in Los Angeles, my world fell apart. It was the disaster I always feared, and it took over my life. After delivering the B-29 plane, Susan was in high demand as a test pilot. She was sent to the Flight Test Division at Wright-Patterson Air Base. My love was testing the new P-59, a jet plane, while I dealt with our Tommy problem. And no, you don't have to remind me whose job was more exciting. Test pilots get the glory because every day could be their last. I didn't want to think about that, but the risk was always there. The P-59 era Comet was a bad plane. It was like a King Cobra plane, but with 2 British jet engines on the sides. The heat from the engines often caused problems, making the plane's engine stop in mid-air. Even in practice fights, the era Comet lost to older piston engine planes like the P-47S and P-38S, but the government bought them anyway. Not for combat, but to show that the US had jet fighters too, since Germany had the Me-262. It made the Air Force look better, so we bought 100 just for appearances. They were trying to give the impression that we had some kind of jet fighter, even though it wasn't very good. Each era Comet was tested before it was accepted, and the Wasps were the best at these tests. The testing was done at Wright Field in Dayton, and that's what Susan was doing. One otherwise perfect day in Ohio, Susan was landing an era Comet, tail number 44, 22620 when both engines failed. She was flying what was essentially a brick. Observers said she did a remarkable job trying to glide it to the runway, but she fell short by about 100 yards. The plane crashed, skidded, hit a fence, and then plunged into a deep ditch. I first heard about the crash from Jackie. She said, "There's been a situation with Susan, using Wasp code for a plane crash. Anyone who has lost someone close knows what happened next." My vision blurred, adrenaline surged, and my heart raced. The voice in my head screamed, "No! This can't be happening!" Tears welled up in my eyes. Jackie waited patiently, having experienced this many times before. She finally said, "I've arranged for Flo Watson to fly you to Wright Pat. She's at Mines on a delivery and waiting for you at the North American hangar." That was Jackie being kind. She knew how I felt about Susan. The Wasps were delivering the 2-seater version of the P-51D so I could ride to Dayton. Susan survived the crash but was in critical condition. Her life hung by a thread. I arrived at the hospital after a record-fast flight. Lorraine flew quickly because she saw how much pain I was in. At the nurse's station, I must have looked like I had escaped from a mental ward, frantic and disheveled. They might have stopped me since I wasn't family, but I used my position as chief of staff for the Wasps to get in. At only 25, I had already seen too much sorrow from losing friends in service. Connie, Hazel, and Evelyn were alive one day and gone the next. You can't understand how that feels unless you've been there. Losing my friends hurt deeply, but it was nothing compared to seeing Susan, my brave love, lying still on white hospital sheets. She had paid the price for her service. I hoped it wasn't the ultimate price. An old, experienced nurse led me to Susan's room, exuding a feeling of kindness. She was exactly the sort of woman I wanted caring for my love. Susan's lovely face looked calm, her big, smart eyes shut. She was breathing lightly, but at least she was still alive. She had injured her head, causing unconsciousness, but the doctors thought she would wake up soon without further complications. Meanwhile, Susan was in a medically induced coma to aid her healing. The doctors planned to reduce her pain medication in a few days once they deemed her safe. Susan wasn't killed immediately because of her safety belt, but she must have been pressing the foot pedals hard when she crashed. The plane bent sharply after hitting the far side of the ditch, causing the control panel to fall onto her legs. The surgeons saved her legs, but her right knee was so damaged that she would need a replacement. I believe there's a special person for everyone, except those who do only bad things and wonder why their life is hard. They get what they deserve. Good and humble people will find their special person. I had found Susan. She completed me, and everything felt right. Now, I faced the idea of spending the rest of my life missing her, and I was only 25. I had heard the tower recordings, and Susan's last words before the crash were, "Tell Eric I love him." Hearing that turned me, the respected leader of the group, into a crying baby. I wiped my eyes and wept. What will I do without her? But the fight wasn't over. Susan was giving it her all, and I planned to join her in the battle. With determination, I walked back to the nurse's station and called Jackie. She answered, "How is she?" I said, "Not good, but I'm staying with her until she gets better. I need you to get Arnold to let me stay in her room the whole time." A call came in to the nurse's station a half-hour later. The nurse answered it. A voice on the line talked for a minute. The nurse kept saying, amazed, "Certainly, General Arnold," and "Of course, General Arnold." Then she hung up and asked me, "Do you need a pillow?" I quickly got used to the busy hospital environment. Susan was moved to a private room by orders from Hap, and there was a comfy chair next to the window. For the next 5 days, I was either in that chair or finding something to eat. Sleeping while sitting up is a skill for the truly worn out. By day 5, I had gotten quite good at it. I talked to Susan as she lay there, her chest rising and falling while the machine helped her breathe. I hoped my talking might bring her back to me, like a pilot follows a signal to land. I read her happy stories by Thurber and Runyon. I told her all about my life and our future plans, just so she could hear my voice. I found a small book of poems in the hospital library, Shakespeare's sonnets, and read every one to her. One line from a sonnet hit me hard. "Love doesn't change with the tiny hours and days, but stands strong even to the end." My eyes teared up. That happened a lot these days. I promised myself I would never give up and never leave her. Then, one bright Ohio morning, I woke from a brief nap, having slept in 15-minute intervals day and night for a week. I saw Susan looking at me. She was awake, but still groggy, like someone after a long sleep. She wasn't talking, just staring at me as if she thought I was a dream. Seeing her awake was such a surprise that I yelped, which startled her. I probably scared her more when I ran out of the room and up to the nurse's station, where I stood, panicking until the nurse calmed me down enough to understand she's awake. Then it felt like half the hospital staff rushed into Susan's room. They kept me in the hall while they checked on her. Eventually, the old nurse came out, smiled kindly, and said, "You can see her now. She's very tired, so don't push her, but she's awake and will recover." I'm not very religious. I believe in a higher power, sure, but organized religion feels too much like a business to me, like people arguing about cars. So I haven't prayed much. My family went to Grace Church most Sundays, but Episcopalians expect that. Still, I felt like I owed something to that higher power, the one keeping the universe running smoothly. So I quietly said, "Thanks." The universe had decided that 2 humble humans were worth saving, no matter how tiny we are in the grand scheme of things. And I was grateful. In all relationships, there's a moment when you know for sure that the other person loves you. It might be a look or a gesture, and it strengthens the bond needed to get through tough times. I had that moment when I walked back into the room. The look of love on Susan's face said it all. I was speechless. My love had survived a nearly fatal plane crash, been in a coma for 8.5 days, and already had major surgery. But she looked just like the night I first saw her 4 years ago. She even had her usual floppy ears haircut. I walked to her bedside, and she slowly lifted her hand. I held it tight as we looked ahead to our endless future together. Months later, I watched Susan hobble toward me, leaning on her dad's arm. She wore a Santiago blue dress with a Wasp black beret tilted on her head, her hair neatly tucked away. My best man, who was actually a woman, stood next to me, and the bridesmaids, all top-notch pilots, waited across from us. No one held flowers. The National Cathedral was huge, but we needed all the space. 2 of Georgetown's elite families were joining in marriage. Our dads, who paid for the big event, invited around 300 of their closest friends. It was the big society event of the year, but it wasn't a typical white dress wedding. Susan wanted it to show who she really was, a Wasp ferry pilot, not a fancy Georgetown girl. So the wedding party wore their best Wasp uniforms, with silver wings on their chest and AAF patches on their shoulders. Dee Dee and Dorothea, 2 B-29 pilots, and Flo, who had flown me across the country at record speeds, dressed just like Susan in Santiago blue uniforms with silver wings and medals, and uniform pants instead of skirts. Susan needed pants to hide the scars from her recent leg surgery. I thought our wedding was too soon after her accident, but Susan wanted the ceremony to make our bond official. Most people would still be in bed, suffering from the pain. Susan pushed that pain deep down and carried on. She was strong and determined, especially for us. That gave me hope for our future. Back then, most men had wartime friends, but Wasps were all women, and I was naturally a loner. I didn't have close male friends. One person, though, was brave and inspiring, Jackie Cochran. The word girly never described Jackie. Strong, fearless, and impressive, but never girly. I asked her to stand with me. She felt honored. There was a bubble around the six of us as Susan and I exchanged vows. It came from shared struggles and facing death daily. We had done something special, something the regular folks in the church would never grasp. In just 4 years, Susan and I had grown from kids to adults. Our souls were shaped by conflict and our commitment to honor. My new wife was beautiful, but more importantly, she was strong and capable. She knew what self-sacrifice and duty meant, proven by her actions. As we settled into our house in Bethesda, the war ended. The surrender news was special to us because it was Tibbets flying a B-29 that convinced Japan to quit. Both Susan and I needed to find something to do after the war. Like many who worked hard to win it, adjusting to normal life was tough. It was even harder for us. The returning vets had the GI Bill and the thanks of a grateful nation. Susan and I, working for a civilian agency, had no military benefits. Plus, no one knew what we did because the Wasp records were sealed. To most people, the Wasps were just something related to beekeeping. It's hard to endure what we did and get no recognition or reward, but that was our reality at the start of our marriage. I was a one-armed high school graduate with no war record. Susan was a former commercial pilot whom no airline would hire because passengers back then wouldn't fly with a woman pilot. We had some family money, but our decision to join the Wasps instead of attending Princeton or one of the Seven Sisters colleges didn't sit well with our parents, so they didn't support us much. It was Susan and me against the world. I finally found a job that required no education or experience. I took it because I had no other choice. No, it wasn't day labor. It was becoming a member of the House of Representatives. The only real requirement for that job was knowing the right people. I met many important individuals while advocating for the Wasps on Capitol Hill. I had 4 special qualities. I was from the generation that just saved the world. I was one of the first wounded in the war. I was an accomplished pilot. And thanks to Jackie Cochran, I had strong backing from Hap Arnold and the AAF. So local election parties courted me intensely. Both sides wanted me. I worked with Sam Rayburn, the Democratic speaker, who seemed like a professional good old boy. His counterpart, Joe Martin, had a simpler background like mine. Plus, Truman's approval rating was very low. So I became a Republican with some Democratic views underneath. The Maryland 4th had an open seat, and many civil service residents knew me. My parents loaned me money for a down payment to move to Bethesda. I think my dad gave me the money mostly because he didn't want to see me again. Maybe he would have understood if I had told him I was gay. But a Republican, really. The 1946 midterm elections were tough because President Roosevelt was dead, and the Democrats couldn't agree on a new leader. So, I won by a large margin. It was easy because the timing was right. Susan was a big help during the campaign. She was not only beautiful, but also a female pilot. The media loved her pretty face and brave attitude. So, here I was, a 25-year-old pilot with one arm, now working in the U.S. House of Representatives. I was lucky to have a good team of staff, but I quickly got rid of the ones who weren't good workers. Running a Wasp training program teaches you how to find the good workers and get rid of the bad ones. I stayed in the same office in the Longworth building for the next 60 years. I eventually became the chair of the House Armed Services, not because I was smart, but because I was there for a long time. I was good at making voters like me, which kept me in office, but I wasn't great at the actual work. That's where Susan came in. She was my strongest supporter and my partner. Susan wrote the important reports that made me seem knowledgeable about military matters. She could plan things and write them down. Well, I was just a former pilot with a friendly smile. We worked as a team, and I relied on Susan's wisdom and kindness to get through life. Epilogue. My granddaughter stared at Major Fuller like she was a hero. Then I heard a familiar voice say, "There you are, you old man. I've been looking for you." I knew that voice well. I had heard it every day for the past 67 years. Susan and I were a great pair. She had a slight limp as she attached my prosthetic arm. To me, she was as beautiful as the day we met when she helped me wake up by waving smelling salts under my nose. She wore her blue uniform, which still fit her, and her hair was as white as mine. Her wrinkles showed the strong spirit within. I know young people think it's gross to see old people in love. I see it every time our big family gathers, 4 children and 9 grandkids. They just see 2 old, weak people. They don't see the brave young woman stepping out of a B-29 plane to hug the tough Wasp leader. To them, we are just 2 old people waiting to die, invisible and unimportant. But I say, bless them all. Someday, if God wills it, they will understand how it feels. Even so, Major Fuller had no problem showing respect to Susan. She gave her a salute and then took Susan's hand, saying, "We studied you in the academy. I wouldn't be here if you hadn't paved the way for us." My granddaughter looked amazed. The idea that her old grandma had anything in common with someone as impressive as Amy Fuller was unbelievable to her. To my granddaughter, Nana was the loving person who held the family together. Sure, she needed help with the stairs sometimes, but what had Nana ever done that was worth studying? Major Fuller leaned down to my granddaughter and said, "Do you see that medal your grandma is wearing?" My granddaughter saw the big gold medal around her neck. Amy continued, "Your Nana got that medal because she used to fly planes like I do. She helped the United States win World War II." At that, my granddaughter's eyes widened. Amy added, "She's a hero, just like the ones in your storybooks. And she's my hero too. More importantly, you can achieve your dreams now because your Nana proved that women can fly just as well as men." The look on Susan's face said it all. She didn't care much about the medal she received in old age, but knowing she had made it easier for her granddaughter to pursue her dreams meant everything to her. The Wasps' accomplishments in World War II were significant, but what they did for their daughters and granddaughters made all their sacrifices worthwhile. I want to stress that most of this story happened just as described, and the names are real. The only fictional characters are the narrator, his wife Susan, and Major Fuller, who in real life is Captain Amy Rebel Fiedler. Everything that happened to the real people happened as I said. But other than their names and actual events, everything else is fiction. I didn't know them personally and don't know what they were like. Susan is based on all the women who served with the Wasps, reflecting their attitudes and journeys. I used the real-life deeds of Dorothea Struther for the B-29 incident. Dorothea was actually in the cockpit with Dee Dee Moorman on that flight. I included Dorothea in the wedding to make it up to her, and I didn't ask her to wear an ugly dress. Wasp service is now public knowledge, and Jackie Cochran was a larger-than-life American hero throughout her career, including being the first woman to break the sound barrier and later setting up the Women's Astronaut Program for NASA. The Women Air Force Service Pilots, Wasp, became part of history on December 20th, 1944, at Sweetwater Field. General Hap Arnold spoke at their final ceremony. The Wasps have finished their mission. They did their job well, but it wasn't easy. 38 Wasps died helping our country win the war. The Air Forces will always remember their service and sacrifice. We in the Army Air Forces are proud of you. We will always owe you a lot. But honestly, this wasn't true. Back then, no one wanted women pilots. For example, one Wasp went to Northwest Airlines with her flying qualifications. She had a rare seaplane pilot's rating and a commercial rating. She had over 1,000 hours of flying time when most new male pilots had less than 400. Northwest was so impressed that they offered her a job as a stewardess. Society's rejection hurt these brave women. One Wasp said, "I wanted so badly to keep flying. It kind of broke my heart. But that's okay because that was just how it was. Nobody even knew we existed. I kept my uniform, my pictures, my books. I told my kids when I die, put them in my coffin." In some ways, this was the Wasp's own doing. These capable women went back to normal life without complaining. They got no college benefits like other World War II veterans. They lived as regular wives and mothers. Also, the records of the Wasp program were hidden for 35 years, so their contributions were little known. You don't need to tell me either. Other women's service branches had their deeds recorded publicly. It almost seems like someone wanted the Wasp story hidden because of how poorly they were treated. It took another mistake by the military to finally give the Wasps the credit they deserved. In 1971, the Air Force announced that for the first time, women could be military pilots. This finally allowed the Wasps to tell their story. The Wasps could now talk about their flights and the dangers they faced. The American press loved it, Anyone fair and smart could see that the Wasps deserved recognition and military benefits. But it was the 1970s now, not the 1950s. Senator Barry Goldwater, himself a ferry pilot during World War II, was the main supporter for the Wasps. I mentioned him because the coincidence was too interesting. He wasn't involved in Cornelia Ford's death, but he knew sometimes you need to play tough to do the right thing. He introduced a bill in the Senate for military recognition of the Wasps and said he would attach a Wasp amendment to every bill until it passed. Even though many opposed Goldwater's bill, including the VA, American Legion, VFW, and even President Jimmy Carter, Congress finally did the right thing. They declared the Wasp service as active duty and gave honorable discharge certificates to all former Wasps. It might have been 37 years late, but at least it corrected a great wrong. Finally, in 2010, the Wasps were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. Since this was nearly 70 years later, many medals were accepted by the pilots' adult children. I wonder what these people thought when they saw pictures of their moms as young, lively women smiling from airplanes. These women broke new ground. Winning in Congress meant that a few days after the law passed, General Hap Arnold's son, who also fought for the Wasps, could proudly tell a former Wasp that she could put the American flag on her colleague's grave to celebrate the 4th of July. The fact is, many brave women in other services died during World War II, but the Wasps were the only group to have active service deaths. They lost 38 members in action, and one went missing. They continued to serve without reward or recognition because they believed in America and what it stood for. And that, in my view, defines commitment, duty, and honor. Our freedom as Americans is secured by the courage of those who serve. No group was braver or more dedicated than the World War II Wasps. For those interested, the National Wasp 12 Museum is at Sweetwater Field. It opened on May 28, 2005, the 62nd anniversary of the first Wasp graduating class. For the complete Wasp history, visit the Smithsonian's Udvar Hazy Center. The heroism and selflessness you see there will impress and move you. To see how far we've come since the Wasps began opening doors, search for the YouTube video of 2nd Lieutenant Madison Marsh, Viper pilot, and the current Miss America, Daniel Tiberius Iverson, Ann Arbor, Michigan, July 2024. Thanks for listening to One Infidelity Hit. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop us a like.